Well, hello there everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me along tonight to help in this discovery process about this little known fellow called Richard Dawson. There he is, I think, in a top hat, standing down in the mud in the tank stream, but I'll come back to a colour version of that image. Richard Dawson was the first significant iron founder in this country, and that led him into engineering, and he became a very significant engineer in the early days of the colony. The things that I want to do tonight in this presentation will be to highlight some of the contributions to Australian engineering history of this eminent but largely forgotten colonial ironmaster and engineer. From down at the lower end of George Street, I'll come to the details of that shortly, and on Sydney Cove. Over the years from 1833, when he arrived in the colony aged 33, through to his death in 1865, so he spent about the second half of his life here, and then in the Foundry's next half dozen or so years, managed by his widow and her son before it became or went into the possession of Mort. So we'll be looking at him, we'll be looking at his role in the importation and the transplantation to the colony, or technology transfer if you like, of ironworking technologies from England. He wasn't the only one doing that, but he certainly did a great deal of it, moving the technological advances of England's industrial revolution into a colonial setting, with some difficulty I might say. We'll look at the challenges he faced, and there were quite a few of them, and what he did to overcome them. And we'll be looking at some images of surviving iron artefacts that we've been able to locate. There aren't many of them, but there's certainly some that bear his maker's mark. And I'll talk about the search for others. And in fact, one of the things that I want to do is to appeal tonight to anyone who knows of others or who comes across others in the future. Please be in contact with me, because although I don't collect them, I'm not allowed to. They take up too much room, I'm told. I don't collect the things, but I like to photograph them, and I like to have an image gallery of whatever's out there. There he is, one of only two photographs we have of him. He was, I need to admit at the beginning, my great-grand-grand uncle. I'm descended from his sister's line. That photograph was published in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1932, about the time of the Harbour Bridge celebrations. There was a lot of stuff about ironworks and the steel industry, and they read an article called Our First Iron Founder, and they included that photograph. I've never been able to find out where they got it from. Now, where was the Foundry? The Foundry is marked by the two arrows there. You can see George Street marked clearly, and then down in more or less the centre of the map, and this is an 1833 map, the year that he arrived here, is a fairly large block of land that belonged to a fellow named Weston. Dawson never owned the land on which his foundry operated. He leased it from the Weston family, and Weston's daughter, his name was Johnson, over a 4-decade period. He did not buy the land. It's a significant parcel of land, occupying about 7,000 square metres, although boundaries weren't always in the one place. In hard economic times, his boundaries contracted as he sublet parts of that land to others. When things were going very well, and all of that land was occupied, then he leased adjoining land. Houses were built along the George Street frontage of the land. His was one of them. His next door neighbour was a sailmaker, a fellow named Irwin. There were others there. One was the house that became the first Knock and Kirby store. Some of you might have seen that wonderful photograph of it, covered in like a JB Hi-Fi store, with the way it's covered with prices and specials and so forth. But that's the block of land. So it had two frontages. It had a street frontage to George Street, and then it had a water frontage to the tank stream and the entrance to Sydney Cove, at least until the mid-1850s, when circular quay, semicircular quay was built, and the tank stream covered over, and New Pitt Street was the extension of Pitt Street. And then the block had both the George Street frontage and a Pitt Street frontage. But that's where it was. What's there now, there've been a sequence of buildings there over the years. The Knock and Kirby's were there very early. When they sold and moved further down to the Queen Victoria building, the Ironworkers Union bought their store and operated there for a while. An 18-storey office building has been demolished in the last 12 months, and the new development of 200 George Street, a 31-storey Mirvac building, is being constructed on part of that land. So it's very much at George Street in Sydney Cove. And in that way it was unusually located. There were other smaller foundries later on the banks of the Tank Stream, but most were in the Darling Harbour precinct. This lead plaque is on display in the Powerhouse Museum. I photographed it there in 2008, but that was on the George Street frontage of the foundry and was cast in 1845. On the George Street frontage again, and this is from the book many of you will be familiar with, the Fowles book, Sydney in 1848, you can see Dawsons House, where he was labelled as shipsmith on the front of the place, and the yard and the foundry are behind it, and through the passageway there you can see furnaces and cranes and whatever else that Fowles was trying to depict. This is the colour version of what I had on the title slide. It's part of a painting. I abstracted it because I wanted to be able to show the Dawson sign of a painting called Circular Quay. Sometimes it's called Pride of the Seas because that was the name of the American boat that was really being painted. And in the background there is George Street's away to our right, and this is the Tank Stream Sydney Cove frontage with a Dawson sign to make known to visiting ships captains that he was there, because a lot of the foundry work that he did was marine foundry work. And I don't know, but I like to speculate that there he was one afternoon when the painting was being done, top hat and all, wandering around in the mud and stench down on the banks of the stream, admiring his domain. And all for business, no doubt. Now, as I've said, the foundry covered about 7,000 square metres, with its outer boundaries shifting outwards and contracting inwards according to circumstances. In the recession, or depression rather, of the early 1840s, those boundaries shrank quite a bit, but in later years, in the 1850s, when he got into making gold mining machinery and so forth, and he needed more land and he leased land from adjacent. Initially, he imported anchors and chains, winches, lighthouse apparatus and so forth, but very quickly he moved to casting buoys. There was a big demand for cast iron buoys, and in the 1830s, he and his business partner Henry Castle was a partner with him for 3 years, did that and made household grates and stoves. Then they progressed to casting tallow pots or boiling down pots, threshing and winnowing machines, wool presses, posts, veranda columns, railings, pumps, guns, and even a cannon at one stage. Cannon was interesting. He invited people to the domain at dusk one night, and they were expected to pay a fee, and we would demonstrate this cannon. But the City Council stopped him on an early version of public safety rules. So he moved the whole show to Petersham and did the same. And I think it worked. Pumps, weighing machines, water and sewage pipes, quartz stampers and parts, and a lot of work on steamships and steamship screws, especially for the ASN company. Now the foundry again incorporated the family home on George Street. The two numbers there, it's the same block. It was 622, and then it was renumbered in the middle 1850s to 186. Plus he had some iron stores and some furnaces. He had a wharf at the back of that, very shallow water wharf, but big enough that he assembled there for a ship owner in Sydney, an 80-tonne double-ended iron-hulled paddle steamer in 1837, but then found its way onto the Parramatta River trade. That was put together on the wharf down there where he was standing in the mud a few minutes ago in our presentation. He had work sheds, he had blacksmith fires, furnaces, steam engines, including one that they built there in 1835, cranes, a steam hammer. He had a hayloft, he had a carriage shed, machine shop, and as time went on, the machine shop became more and more important. It was a sole trading business that he operated for most of this time. After 1837, for the first couple of years, he was in partnership with a fellow named Henry Castle. Castle came from an English shipbuilding company. We don't think that they knew one another. I'm in contact with the Castle family in England, and I understand there's a person from that family in the audience here tonight. We think that they met here. They quickly got on and built the foundry, but in the beginning of 1837, Henry Castle went back to England, where he founded what became a huge firm of Castle's shipbreaking at Vauxhall Bridge on the Thames. But for most of the time, Dawson was a sole trader, but he had numerous short-term partnerships. At one stage, he ran a coal yard on that same land with his neighbour. He ran a timber yard. Over the whole time, he was a ship's agent. He owned ships, about a dozen, about 2 or 3 at any one time. He set up a trading station on Lord Howe Island, without going there as far as I'm able to tell, but by sending others, which supplied food and other produce to visiting American whaling ships, particularly American ones, but others as well. And later in his life he got into ice making, and he was one of the 2 patent holders. He and Dominic Nicole took out the early patents for ice making machinery. But his name never seems to really get associated with that because he died in 1865. And that was the foundry itself. Now here's one of these artefacts, not the steam engine, the pot. That sits in an open yard at the Gundagai Open Air Museum. My brother took it a couple of years ago. It's a single casting of a large tallow pot or boiling down pot. And the close-up over there is on the pot. That's his maker's mark, made in 1844. Now he made a lot of those, and there are several that have survived. That's by far the biggest one. When I stand alongside it, it comes up to about here, and it's about 6 foot across. The casting in old language is about 1/2 inch thick. It's now cracked on the other side, as you'd expect. They were built into a brickwork furnace underneath, a sheet thrown in and boiled down for their tallow. At a time in the depression of the 1840s, when sheep otherwise were worth nothing at all. But he advertised these extensively, and that is the largest one that we've come across.
What would they weigh? 3 or 4 tonne?
I've seen weights for them, yes. I've seen 60, 100 weight, so yeah, it's 3 tonne. How they got to Gundagai, I've got no idea. But this one here, cousin of mine, Rick Nelson, photographed that one on a homestead just on the outskirts of Armidale. It's a museum at the moment. And it's a small one, but it's still quite significant. And that is the brick furnace assembly that held it. It fitted into the top of that, and the fire was lit under it. Transporting that one still would have been a challenge, but nothing like that big fella we just saw. But in both those cases, the maker's market's on them. This one, he's got a little box around it there, and he's got a number on it. And the number is 150, I think. That was gallons. He sold them in gallon sizes. They started at 150, and the big one was 1,500. And he guaranteed, so his maths must have been pretty good, he guaranteed that if he said it was 150, it was exactly 150. So that took a bit of calculating. And how they were cast, I haven't figured out. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a historian either, by the way. So how that was actually cast, I haven't discovered. There's one that's found its way. It's up in the Stockman's Hall of Fame, up at Longreach. It's a much smaller one, a 100-gallon one. And it doesn't look like it's spent as much time out in the open as the ones we saw. It doesn't look like it's seen so much weather. That one's up there, and David Massell sent me that one a couple of years ago. It's on display in the museum. Here's another one, interestingly displayed, sitting in an old tyre from the museum at Glen Innes. That one is a 300 above Dawson. in the little rectangle there, you can't read it from where you are, but it says R. Dawson, Sydney, and above it 300, so that's a 300 gallon. The ones that I've seen, it's not very many, the rims are different, but the big one at Gundagai simply had no rim at all. It's just the sides more or less stopped at the top of the pot. This one clearly has a rim, but I think the rim there is thinner. Now this one's been sent to me by Wendy Noble down from the Davidson whaling station. I know that Dawson's ships frequently made voyages to Foul Bay. I'm guessing, but that's all, that's how this one went down. It's sitting over there at the side of the building, gathering water off the roof at the moment in a pretty grim looking situation. But there it is, there's another one. I haven't got his name mark on that, but I've seen assurances in the literature that it does say R. Dawson, Sydney. Something altogether different, the fluted columns. Now these are beautifully made fluted columns, and there are 14 of them that survive in the Sydney Central Business District. And they are in the Pitt Street Uniting Church, which was built in the 1840s as a congregational church. And Dawson cast the columns.
Are they solid or hollow?
I don't know, but the fluted columns that I look at on building sites and in heritage building yards, but all the ones I've seen are hollow. Now, a few years ago, Kevin Browning, who is from the Royal Australian Artillery Historical Society, contacted me when he found out I was interested. He said, you ought to go down the Middle Harbour and thrash around the grass down there for a while, and you'll come across these cannon pivots. Now, there were at least 3 of them. We don't know how many there were initially, but there's one sort of in situ over here, and the cannon rested on it. How much cast iron is under the ground, I don't know, but I guess the pivot reaches ground level and then spreads out, because after all the cannon had to move around. That one over there, you can just read on it. It's been in the weather since the 1850s at the old fort, Dawson, Sydney. That's a pretty easy casting as far as I can see compared with the others. It's a lump of iron. One of the reasons that this foundry was a significant place was because of the numbers of men that it employed. The records that I can find show that at any one time there were anything from 50 to 75 men and boys working on the site. And on one occasion, one woman. I don't know what she did, possibly worked in the store or with accounts. But over a 40-year period, that adds up to many, many hundreds of people who found employment at the foundry. So Dawson's foundry, like the other foundries, Blanch's and John Struth's foundry and the Russells and the ones that followed, were all fairly significant employers of men. And there were the sorts of occupations that the Dawson employees followed. Whether they come from, they simply come out of trove from the advertisements he placed in the Herald and the Empire and the Australian and the Colonist and the other early newspapers when he needed employees. In the earlier days of his foundry, he didn't advertise much for people because they simply turned up from the boats, some of them as convicts assigned to him, and some were assigned to Henry Castle as well during the time they were in business together. But during the 1850s, when labour was a lot harder to get because people were off for the gold rushes, he advertised a lot, often weekly and fortnightly, and for multiple numbers of people following those sorts of, from simple activities like blacksmithing and shipsmithing, right, and letter cutting for cattle brands, through to machinists and engineers and so forth, and then people to work in the store and the counting house. You also had apprentices there, some of them as young as 8, which surprised me because 14 would be more likely the age, but 1 or 2, 8 years old, working as apprentices. But mostly I think they were 14. And their ages came to note when they got into trouble over something outside the foundry and were taken before the magistrate. And they said they worked at Mr. Dawson's foundry. And how are they? Son? Oh, I'm 8. Now, developing a foundry of that size and making it work for 4 decades did not come without its challenges. There they are, listed down the left-hand the left-hand side. The first one was, as I guess you all know better than I do, the early days of the colony weren't characterised by British government or any local government to be concerned about manufacturing. As far as authorities were concerned, manufactured goods would come from England and agricultural produce would be returned. Now that was largely ignored by a number of people, including Dawson. He wasn't the only one to ignore it, but it was a challenge at the beginning. Iron supply was clearly a challenge. There was no iron produced here. You see, what he did as a founder was to take already manufactured iron in the form of pig iron, melt it down in a furnace, and then cast it into moulds. That's basically what iron founding was. But where to get the iron from? The first iron that was made here was made at the Fitzroy Ironworks at the rather optimistically named New Sheffield, i.e. Mittagong, in 1848. And there wasn't much of it, and from what I read, the quality was lacking. But the iron that he used was imported. It came on the boats. When I look at the cargo lists of ships arriving in Sydney over the time of the foundry, a vast number of them, probably a majority amongst the other goods they carried, simply carried iron, much of it in the form of pig iron.
As ballast or?
Some of it as ballast, but some of it was imported specifically for the purpose, yes. And then there was a developing market in local scrap, and that included a lot of their own, because again, as far as I can determine, early iron foundry work was an inexact science, and a lot of moulded castings were judged to be of too poor quality to sell, so they just went back into the furnace and away they went again. Coal supply was a much bigger problem. There was no immediate supply of coal, and the coal had to come from Newcastle. Eventually, Dawson started to buy ships, small ships, I'm talking in the range of 30 to 120 tonnes. They'd carry more than that, but that was their ship weight. They might carry 80 or 90 tonnes up to 200 tonnes. And he virtually employed them doing a shuttle service between Sydney Cove, his own wharf when he had it, but the Cove wharfs later on, and Newcastle, bringing coal. The first one of those ships that he had built lasted 3 months and was wrecked at Newcastle Beach. Its replacement lasted a little bit longer than that and was wrecked at Bruley on the south coast on its way to take some surplus coal to Melbourne and a dozen convicts as well. So although he had a solution to the problem, he'd bring it himself from Newcastle, it wasn't all beer and skittles. Ships cost money and he lost them and he lost crews. And it did work. He was able to get quality coal, get it to the foundry, and often have a surplus to sell. One of his early letterheads, or billhead, is a sort of sketch, a stylised sketch of that land of war. But of course he also brought them into the Cove, and the coal came in sacks, so that lumpers, as they were called, they were the guys that threw a sack over their back and walked up the hill with it, did that heavy work. Now, skilled labour, that was always going to be difficult. A lot of those jobs involved skill, the engineering jobs, the jobs with the steam engines and the machining jobs. The pattern maker, they're the fellows who were making the moulds for the iron. They were skilled, and he was relying on immigrant labour. He wasn't sponsoring them himself, as far as I can see, but he was finding them when they arrived, or they were finding him. Assigned convicts, and then others that were trained on the site, apprentices, but older ones older as well. I've got no idea how much he brought with him. I don't know very much about his earlier life in England, in Bristol, where he came from. But he certainly had an ability to borrow money, and the banks of the time were pretty ready to hand it out. So he did borrow significant amounts of money, and with his Scottish background, he seemed to know how to manage it pretty well, and he reinvested his profits. In 1843, though, he became insolvent with debts of around £10,000, and that's a very significant sum of money. £1,200 of it alone was owed to a Newcastle in England ships equipment supply company who weren't very happy when they got the news. He owed considerable sums of money to the bank, But he wasn't alone. I mean, in the 1840s and 1842 and 1843 and 1844 in particular, it's as if every manufacturer and every merchant and every shipowner, one after the other, fell like a pack of cards. And he was in a sense a bit lucky because he didn't have to sell his land because he didn't own the land. And his landlord was understanding because who else could he get to lease it? No one else had any money either. So Dawson quickly bought it back with more borrowed money and was back in business in less than 12 months, advertising that he could cast anything, no problem at all. He did get back on his feet very, very quickly, but his debts were high. Carry on regardless. And then there was the other problem of the small size and the changing nature of colonial markets. He may have been the first ironfounder here, first significant one, he was. And he had a very big share of the market until the middle to late 1840s and beyond. But it was a tiny market. And then when he got here in the 1830s, the population of Sydney was about 30,000 people. You're talking Tamworth or Wagga. You're talking smaller than Tamworth or Wagga. So it was a limited market and it changed rapidly. Shipping, gold rushes, there was this enormous demand for gold mining machinery, stampers, and so there was a big market for parts for them, particularly the cast iron stamps themselves, the block that whacked the quartz. Some more of these artefacts, they did a lot of work on veranda columns, and you may come across, and if you do, I'd love to hear about them. You may come across veranda column work. That is Mill's Cottage at Point Fairy in Western Victoria near Warrnambool, and it was built as far as the experts down there can determine around about 1850, well, the veranda was added about 1855, and it has these R. Dawson Sydney veranda posts. Now this house with this column, Phoebe Cottage, still stands in a pretty derelict form, as you can see. He built it late in his life at Schofield. It's right alongside Schofield's railway station on several acres of land. And he built it as a country retreat or a retirement home. Did the building in the late 1850s, probably up to about 1860. Now, there are 10 veranda posts, and they are all identical except for one thing, and that is that one of them, and only one, has R. Dawson on it. That taught me something because I thought, you know, I've looked at houses, looked at one or two, there's no mention of the maker's name and I'm on the way. Now I look at the whole lot. For some reason, he put it just on one of them. That's a fireplace from inside that house. A lady from Schofield sent it to me. She had visited that house in 1991 during an estate agent's open day, and with the agent's permission, she photographed the various rooms, which was a marvellous find. There's no Dawson mark on that. It might have been someone else's, but he cast so many of those, I'd be very surprised if he hadn't cast that one. What I've learned since is that fireplaces like that rarely, if ever, have the maker's mark on the front, but they have them on the back, which makes it mighty hard to find out. And what about these transfers of technology, or what you can call transplants? I mean, convicts were transported here. Technology was transported here. That's what we're talking about, bringing transformative technology transfer. By that I mean a technology transfer that would transform a lot of the manufacturing practices which were developing in the colony. Some of them were simple direct imports of objects. Machines would come off the boat, simple machines like little hand corn mill. What would Dawson do and other ironfounders? They'd go and buy one, pull it apart, make patterns from the parts, start pouring iron, and no sooner than you could snap your fingers. But same with the stamping machines, the quartz stamping machines. By the time they came along though, he had to make them under licence, but they were still copies. With the veranda posts and the pilasters, often the patterns were simply directly imported from English foundries and then used here. Designs were imported. Licences were gained, for instance, for the machines from California to do the quartz stuff. Another way was simply by the employees that turned up and knocked on his door and wanted a job, and who'd worked in foundries in England and might have arrived here in the 1850s, but they'd worked in English foundries up to then, and they brought with them in there, in the head and the hands, the skills and the knowledge and the know-how and the technology, that's a form of technology, from the iron trade, and so all of that sort of technology coming into the country. He got a lot of work in repairing ships. The biggest job that he did was this one, the steamship Croesus. at Berries Bay in 1854. That's a 2,500 ton steamship that came from England. On the way across from the Cape to here, the stern post and the hull at the back was badly damaged. There was a worry that it would not get back to England. It had just cost £90,000. It was on its maiden voyage. He was contracted to build, there was no dry dock, so he was contracted to build a caisson, pump the water out of it, and his men, who are pictured there, in a painting done by the captains of Guy and Hall, and repair it, a 4-month repair that got the ship back to England. He did several major ship repairs. He'd done a similar one in 1845 to a ship called the Thomas Lowry, a 400-ton ship, where he pioneered the use in Australia, and I think perhaps more broadly, but I can't be sure, to use this cofferdam to effect hull repairs under the water line. Not underwater, but under the water line with the water pumped away from. Then in 1854, the one I was just talking about, and then in 1853 through to 1855, he rebuilt the 150 horsepower engines on a steamer called the Phoenix, put in new boilers, new deck, refitted it. Then he paid £4,950 cash for it one day, installed himself as the master because he had ship's master's experience in England, and then sold it on pretty quickly to Robert Towns. Towns sent it off to Singapore with a load of mail, got as far as Thursday Island. It was wrecked on Ippley Reef. Present day divers take great pleasure out of getting down there and photographing what's left of the paddle wheel. That's still there, but that had just been refurbished on that boundary side. There are hundreds of Dawson's advertisements in the early Australian newspapers. This one is particularly interesting to me. It was placed in 1859 after he'd been operating for 25 years or so. But what interests me is the line, second last line, just above his name. No imported articles supplied. In 1833, everything he sold was imported. Till after 1859, and there's a list of what he was making. That's nice from the advertisement to tell us that they were all being made on the foundry, and no doubt there were other things as well. He was also involved in the early experiments with ice making, although you never hear his name much in association with that. The name you hear is Nicole. You hear the name Wilkinson Brothers, you hear the name Thomas Mort. But the original patent was taken out in 1860 by Eugene, Dominic, Nicole and Richard Dawson. I don't expect you to see the details of it, but that was the first of the ice making machine. Now Dawson died not long after that, and so his name simply disappeared from the scene. I think if he'd lived another 10 or 15 years, he would have had a lot more to say and do about that, but that's speculation. Now there's some very quick summary getting towards the end. From a technical journal in 1903, when Norman Selfe, whose name I'm sure you're all very familiar with, had this to say that Richard Dawson's foundry appears to have been the first important iron foundry in Australia, and that Dawson in many branches was the pioneer machinist of Australia. He made reference to Dawson's steam engine. He made quite a few here, but the one that was made in 1837 with Henry Castle. I'm sorry, that one just after Henry Castle left. As a marvel of mechanism, which I suppose all steam engines could have been described at. He referred to the foundry's production of single castings of up to 4 tonnes, particularly for shipping. And he made reference to the fact that the governor of the day and leading people in the colony often visited Dawson's works, and his advice and services were in demand by mill owners, masters of ships, squatters for their war presses, and so on. And finally, he died in 1865. He'd been married 3 times. His first 2 wives had died. He had a son to the second one, but the son died at less than 12 months of age. So he didn't leave a Dawson line. Louisa Bliss inherited the foundry. The Bliss family at Schofields and Riverstone are descended from her and her husband, Captain Andrew Bliss, her first husband. But in 1872, after running it for 7 years with her son, Frederick Bliss, it was sold to Thomas Sutcliffe Mort. And he operated it very briefly as the town branch of his Balmain works. That's how he advertised it in the Herald and the Empire. But as soon as he had transferred Dawson's marvellous stock of wonderful machines from that campus down to the Mort's Balmain campus, he closed it down. Well, I said we'd discover Richard Dawson. That was the aim tonight. That's what I've been trying to do. I think he made a very significant contribution. It got lost for a long while. It's time that it was rediscovered or discovered, whatever, and we bring him back into the history books. So I thank you very much for your interest and for coming along tonight.
Just a point of interest, the captain of that ship was Vine Hall.
It was.
Vine Hall. One of the first general managers of the Sydney County Council was a Vine Hall.
And a fellow named Nick Vine Hall has been a very major figure over the years in the Australian Society of Genealogists. That Captain Vine Hall subsequently captained the maiden voyage of the Great Eastern, that massive steamship. And when he got to New York Harbour, he tore a gash in the side of it on the rock. And interestingly, it was repaired in New York Harbour by a company owned by two blind elderly brothers. It's amazing what you discover when you read the newspaper, using the same technique that Dawson used. Whether Vinehall told him about it or whether it was in more widespread use as a technique, I really don't know. But Vinehall was one of the very well-regarded ship's captains of his time. And he wasn't bad with a paintbrush either, doing his watercolours.
A little bit more on family history. Your Richard Dawson, was he related at all to Robert Dawson, who was one of the first managers for the AA company in the country?
No relation at all. And he even put an advertisement in one of the Sydney newspapers on one occasion saying that I am no way related. The first coal that Castle and Dawson bought from Newcastle, they bought from the AA company and Robert Dawson. And when I first started with this, I thought there may be a connection, but there wasn't.
I noticed that another neighbour of Dawson's was Underwood, and that's where the first commercial shipyard. Was there any business relationships between the two companies?
Well, I've never come across any, and I think the Underwoods were doing their shipbuilding work in the first couple of years of the 1800s. Bear in mind, Dawson didn't get here until 1833, but the Underwood land is adjoining him a little bit further down. But a little bit further upstream, maybe the tank stream was a little deeper. There are instances of how things got around. Dawson advertised from time to time in the press. He wanted a team, by that he meant a bullock team, he wanted a team to take quartz crushing machine to some place called Dirt Hole, practically Dirt Hole, up the hill. That's how they got there, on wagons. But that big thing's been an enormous job, pity the bullocks.
Do you have any understanding as to what was his incentive to come to Australia in the first place?
I know an enormous amount about his life in Australia and relatively little about what came before. He was born in Bristol in 1800. His father, Captain David Dawson, had been born in Fife in Scotland, and he was operating as a ship's captain out of Bristol in the sugar trade to the West Indies, and then in his later life to the East Indies, to Calcutta and the Bay of Bengal. As far as I've been able to determine, Richard Dawson captained two brand new ships built in the Hill House shipyard, one in 1826 to Jamaica, one trip, and the other one in 1829 to Jamaica, one trip. The first one was the Hebe, after which I presume he named Hebe Cotton. But you don't get to captain a ship unless you've done a lot more on ships beforehand, and we have no knowledge of that. When he left England, he gave his occupation as a blacksmith. He never called himself the Captain Dawson, never. Yet that would have, you'd think, have been a marketing plus. When he got here, he gave his occupation as a mariner. Now, I presume blacksmiths were in short supply and that helped him get on the boat. He originally intended to go to Hobart, and the boat got to Hobart, the Enchantress, in 1833. And when it got to Hobart, it was there 2 weeks. But when it left Hobart, he and his wife and daughter were on board. He'd made up his mind. Maybe he made it up long before that. But maybe took a look at Hobart and decided the market there was not going to support his business. And I can find out now a great deal about his father, but I can't yet successfully track down too much about what he did. I know when he got married at Clifton in Bristol, I know with a family lived just out of Bristol.
Where in Cove did his father come from?
From Dysart, I mean the Russells who came here as founders and eventually overtook Dawson.
Getting back to the veranda posts, would they have been cast singly one at a time over a period of time, or would it have just been set up 10 holes in the yard and pull them all at once? And the last one, and someone said, oh, we'd better put our name on this one.
I don't know. Is it much harder to cast with the name on it? I guess it is. But once you've prepared one cast, why couldn't you use more? I've got no idea. That's the only house I've seen that on. But it taught me that if I am looking at a house and I see 3 unmarked pillars, don't turn around and walk away. You never know what that one round the corner will be. Those big pots, by the way, somebody told me they may have been cast upside down. He certainly employed carpenters and pattern makers and lots of them. Any other questions?
I'm just wondering where the wharf was, whether you found it on maps or in images. Was it on Circular Quay or into the tank stream?
The first slide that showed the Dawson sign, that was 1854. In the 1830, he had a wharf there. And as I say, in 1837, a shipper here imported this iron steamer, prefabricated, double-ended thing. And he got the job of putting it together.
Even in the 1830s, the tank stream would have been pretty heavily silted because it was polluted by the time Macquarie arrived here, so it was covered over in 1850s.
It was muddy and filthy and it was a sewer.
Yeah.
I mean, this place isn't very pleasant. And there were goats and pigs roaming around that foundry. I know because of their reports when they were stolen, when they wandered off. It's amazing what you can find out in the papers. I know the names of Dawson's dogs because when someone nicked one or when it wandered off, he went to the local paper.
I noticed that in the list of occupations of people employed, there was mention of hammermen, but there were no strongmen.
Is that what a hammer means?
I don't know, I'm wondering if the
I
two were
never-
equivalent. But
I never, in all the years I've seen of this, I've never encountered that. And the hammermen, was that involved in wrought iron work?
Yeah, when they bent the steel to make an angle,
Yeah.
it was bolted by a series of guys with the big hammers.
Like
Around the
smiths and things like that.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm on harry.irwin, bigpond.com, and I'd love to hear now or in the future if you are looking forward to getting any more of these things. Thank you very much.
thank you.